apologize. I really had to take a break there. My throat was starting to kill me. In fact, it still is. But then I looked at my timeline for this week. Now, I want to get all the Final Fantasy series reviews done by Saturday, which means I need to get booking. I basically actually have to have them done by Friday. It means I have to do at least 3 a day, counting today, in order to keep up with that, right? There's also one problem here. I'm basically going to have to eject 2 of the games. Whoops. Wrong button. From my review. There we go. Now, dropping 13.2 was an easy choice. Done, gone. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be mean, but honestly, that game easily occupies the bottom of my list without a question or hesitation. However, while 10.2 occupies my second bottom slot, I actually have things to say about that, and it's an interesting game to discuss, if nothing else because of what I call the Voyager factor, which I'm going to get into much later, obviously, because that's 10.2, and I'm on 5 now. So I was thinking about the other game to drop, and honestly, I'm going to go ahead and drop 13 as well. The reason why, though, is very simple. While 13 is decently high up on the list, 13, everything I could say about 13 is extremely summarized. There's not much to talk about it as far as theme goes. There's no new ideas there. There's no new concept to really discuss. There's not much to really analyze, to be completely honest with you. It's just a competently executed story, a moderately interesting combat system, um, generally disinteresting characters. Only one of the characters did I actually care about at all, to be completely honest with you, and the others were just there, and then there was Hope, who I wanted to slug every time I was on the screen. The game was too linear. It had too much story, not enough game. Like I mentioned earlier, balance. It went too far that direction. And the graphics were amazing. I will grant it that. It is worth it. The very first time I saw it was on a high-def widescreen TV. And when I say widescreen, I'm talking, my arms actually don't reach that wide. It was at a friend's house, and he set it up, and he was just like, "Here, just watch the intro." And I was like, "Oh my god." Anyways, so yes, the graphics were very nice, and even the in-game graphics were still cutscene quality in general. The music was terrible. I'm sorry, but it was. None of the music was good. I can't think of a single song from FF13 that I liked, with one exception. One song in an entire soundtrack that I actually kept around, which is something bad. That would be the Arclight Steps, for anyone who's curious. Mm. And I guess I could talk in brief. I'm doing my FF13 review right now, basically, if you haven't caught on to that. I will talk in brief about the fact that one of the interesting choices they made, they didn't use this the way they should have, but by having combat be completely segregate and alienated from everything else, while I disagree with that choice for obvious reasons, I do think it enabled them to have the possibility of concentrating on tactics, strategy, of really adding more to bosses, to even normal combat fights, than just, I hit hard and have a lot of HP or whatever. You could have actually really worked with that, really made a lot of Zelda bosses out of it rather than just, bosses with, like, hit him with poison or whatever, you know what I'm saying? But they really fell flat on the potential there, and so ultimately that was a net negative as well. That's it. That's all I got. FF13, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let's talk about the game I'm actually prepared to talk about here. Final Fantasy V. I actually sat down and got some bullet points for this one while I was resting my throat, so I'd be a little more prepared. Hopefully I won't be interrupted. FF5 has a strange, sort of a bad rap amongst gamers, even amongst Final Fantasy gamers, and I've been thinking about why when I was prepping for these reviews in general. Part of it is the fact that there's a very small band of gamers in all 3 gaming groups that would play the Final Fantasy series in general that would get into 5, basically. You have people from that era, the golden era as I call it, 4, 5, 6, and all the games within that range. Who am I kidding? It's 4, 5, 6 are the biggies, and then 7, 8, 9 were alright, and then I'm being disingenuous. I'm sorry. let me start over here. We have people who were fans of the series in the SNES era. We have people who were fans of the series who joined in at the series at the PlayStation era, which is a huge number of people. And those people decided to go ahead and go back and possibly try out the old games. And then we have the people in the much more recent era, which started with FF10, who started in the series at that game. I know several people like that myself. So what we have here is a situation where these three groups of gamers all have to face some level of difficulty to play FF5 because the port of FF5 that came out on the PlayStation was gutter trash, and so that leaves one actual legitimate release of FF5 outside of Japan, and that was pretty recent too. So you have to get what people from one of those three groups of gamers who are actually interested enough to go back to the game, in any case, much more recently, and happen to own a Game Boy Advance or DS or whatever that can actually play it. Now, those people do exist, obviously, myself among them. But what I'm saying here is that the number of people who were interested in FF5 enough to give it a shot were much smaller than any other FF, basically. And the number of people amongst the people who tried it at all who actually enjoyed it were also smaller because a lot of these people, and I want to stress this is not something I'm just saying against, but one thing I've noticed is a lot of the people who joined in at the PlayStation era, and virtually all of the people who joined in at the PlayStation 2 era, can't really go back and enjoy the old games. Some of them can. I've known several who have, but for the most part, they go back and they see older UI, they see older graphics, they see subpar systems, and they think, well, this isn't very fun to play. The story may be interesting, but it's just not catching me. And because they're used to all of the modern conveniences, the modern setup, and indeed the modern graphics, the modern gameplay, or the modern music and sound, and so voice acting for that matter. Too many people prefer those things and indeed require it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's a matter of personal preference. But that was unfortunate for FF5 because of the nature of its release, or lack thereof. Now, I will freely admit that I am fortunate because I got in pretty much at the ground floor of FF5 as much as I could, not living in Japan and not knowing very much, or basically any Japanese, because I was on the RPGE team, as I've said before, who was, for those who don't know, was responsible for translating a few games, including Final Fantasy V when it wasn't available over here, basically. And that is a thing I am eternally grateful for because I still remember after we finally finished that friggin' project, we finally sit down, patched the game, set it up, set it running, started playing it, and my God, I still have wonderful memories of playing through that game for the first time and actually enjoying it. So, anyways, I got fortunate, and I admit that. But it's worth noting that if I was to go back, with the Game Boy Advance release and play FF5, I'd still probably enjoy it. But let's talk about FF5, shall we? Now, FF5 was another one of those games where they tried several things new, and I'll talk about them more in detail as I get through them, but in several cases they said, yeah, we can't actually do this completely new for whatever reason, so let's go ahead and just take something that exists and improve it. I know I keep beating this point into the ground, but it really does deserve mention because of how much they botched this concept later on. So, I apologize, but moving on. It is also worth noting that the argument could be made, nobody's made this argument yet, that some of the more recent games, 13 comes to mind, did take an existing system and modified it, the sphere grid, for example. But it is also worth noting that they decided to change it sufficiently that it was, while it's still recognizable as a sort of sphere grid thing, they went in completely the wrong direction with it. They made it simpler, they made it less good, less interesting, and the rest of the FF13, the combat system, the function, the form changing thing, the AI controlled players were all still new. So my point still stands. Moving along. One of the things that they really did improve upon, though, was the flow. Final Fantasy IV, as I mentioned, despite having one of the greatest RPG stories ever, nevertheless did have some problems with flow because of the nature of the way the game was made and the limitations of the time and facilities and all that fun stuff. Final Fantasy V had no such problems. Final Fantasy V's story was one cohesive, solid, flowing piece of awesome. Every single scene made sense with regards to the scene before it, the scene after it, and the story as a whole. These three parts, for any aspiring writers out here, this is the importance right here. These three things are what each scene in your game, movie, writing book, whatever, should have, ideally. And there's a lot of work involved in that, obviously. FF5 pulled that off magnificently. It was the first FF to really get the flow of story correct, and did so magnificently. It was amazing how much sense it made and how different it was watching the story evolve. It is also worth noting that, well, let's go ahead and let's leave that aside. I'm going to go ahead and follow my little bullet point system here for now. Next thing I want to talk about is the job system. I mentioned this back in 3. FF5 is arguably one of my favorite implementations of the job system because in FF5, it's not just pick a job and stick with it. Rather, you can pick a job and you actually level that job, right? And in so doing, the benefit you get is you get the abilities of that job which you can slot into your command bar. For example, black magic as a black mage, or summoning as a summoner, stealing, throwing, that kind of thing, right? So that was a benefit. You also gained some kind of passive benefit from virtually all of the classes. The ability to walk over poisonous or lava, tiles as a geomancer, the ability to see whole invisible passages as a thief, things like that. These not weren't all necessarily combat related, but some of them were. The black mage, for example, got mana, that kind of thing. In general, there was a reason and a point in leveling the classes other than just having that class, and it worked, and I like that. I have known some people who have complained that there were too many jobs, but if anything, I thought they were basically the perfect number of jobs, personally. Not too many and not too few. But that is, of course, me, and I do love the job system, so let's just move on from that. But it is worth noting that, as usual, what they did was they took what they had, the 3 system, which was built off of the 1 system, and did nothing but improve it. All they did was add to it, all they did was refine it, so that it was more interesting, it was better. And I feel like pointing this out too because this is relevant. Rather than just having a new system, because they could have done just jobs from the beginning, they decided to integrate this new system that they wanted within the story, within the narrative, and actually make it a relevant part of the way the plot is unfolding, which was awesome. I'll get into that a little bit more later, or maybe that's next. Let's see here. Nope, that's 4 points from now. Sorry. Um, I'm sorry if I feel like I'm kind of barreling through these. It's mostly my throat. But I'm going to discuss all of these at length as best as I'm capable. I do apologize to anybody who doesn't want to see the FF series reviewed, but to be completely honest with you, I want to see the FF series reviewed, and I've been wanting to do these reviews for some time. Also, it was among my most requested reviews, so at least hopefully some of you are enjoying this. They did still have a little bit of chop with the combat system. That was not perfected until Final Fantasy VI came around. However, what they did do, I didn't mention this back in FF4 because they added active time battle, ATB system, back in FF4, but it was still a new code. It was still a new system. It was still something that had its flaws, had its bugs, had its quirks. And also, you couldn't see it. You had a sense for it, a mental sense, if you were paying attention, of where everyone's turns were at in relation to the enemies. But FF5 was the first one to actually have the ATB bar over there in the corner, so you could actually see where your turn is in the order, or rather when it will come up again. And this was relevant. I'm going to mention active ATB right now as a general because, again, FF4 and FF5 both were the innovators of this concept. They really wanted to bring the combat a little more action-oriented, but not actually be action-oriented. One of the thoughts that had been pervading amongst Squaresoft at the time was the idea, should we make this more like Zelda? That's really what it came down to. Zelda was doing extremely well. Link to the Past had blown everything off, blown everyone out of the water, and the idea of making combat more combat-y was something that had come up. Eventually, these ideas would produce a game called Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, which would then be refined and enhanced and come out with a much better game, which would be basically the culmination of this Secret of Mana for the Super Nintendo. And then finally, Secret of Mana's ideas would be carried forward, and we have now the Kingdom Hearts series. But all of these ideas started way back when they were first working on FF4 because they wanted to move in that direction. But it was argued down, and I think for the right reason, that there was there was a degree of tactics that was different within a system that was still menu-based combat, if you know what I mean. There were certain benefits to you actually swing your weapon and you actually hit the enemy, but the focus on the Final Fantasy series to date had always been on the story, the characters, the development, and the player's interaction with the party in the sense of managing rather than directly playing, if you know what I mean. And they wanted to keep going with that, and I think that was a good move. I think if they had tried to do the Secret of Mana slash Kingdom Hearts thing all the way back in FF4, the series would have evolved in a completely different direction. Rather, what they did do was they decided to meet halfway. As usual, they had a good idea on this one. They were like, okay, why don't we add just a little bit more activeness? Why don't we add a little bit more interactivity with the combat? And thus the ATB system was born, where you actually have, instead of just, because before this it was you select all the people's actions for this turn, and then whoever has the highest agility based on a roll goes first, and then they go second, then they go third, and they go fourth, and blah blah blah, right? In this case, you actually had the ability of, you know, preparing actions, for example. You could stagger abilities because, certain things took longer to cast and other things, certain actions took longer than some other actions. So, even though you selected his action before his, if you did bio on him and you did nuke on her, something like that. I'm giving really general statistics. Beat the point. You could actually stagger your abilities, and that was especially important with, say, healing, for example, or being able to attack an enemy that was weak at a certain point in time while it was weak, because it doesn't, you don't want to go into its counterattack mode. All sorts of things like that. So I think that was a good move. And FF5, of course, just continued this trend, really adapted the ATB system. And one of the biggest complaints that everyone had with FF4 was we can't see, we can't know when, we want visual, we want a visual representation of where the combat's at. And so they came up with these little bars. Brilliant idea, really simple actually, because technically that was already what was happening. All that they did was added a single line of code, well, more than a single line, but one module that said show it, and there it was, because the actual ATB was already happening behind the scenes. So great move on that part. I also wanted to, uh, where was I? I'm sorry, give me just a moment. Ah, one of the other things FF5 did was it started getting more smooth, more easy to use, easy to identify what's going on. You actually had tooltips in the inventory. You actually could tell what equipment did what. You could actually tell what spells did what. You had a lot more customization options as far as that. The UI as a whole was much more cleaned up. With the increase to the technology for the usage of the SNES, it was a lot easier, there we go, to basically have more data there, for lack of a better way to put it. And so rather than have a limited inventory that you had to sort constantly, they had a relatively large inventory. Rather than have a specific spell list that was always unique to you, you just had spell lists because of the class system. All of it was expanded and moved upon and worked very well and moved very well, in my opinion. One of the other things they did with the new technology that I think was awesome, and this is another first, I keep mentioning these firsts as I go through the series, was the usage of non-standard cutscenes. FF3 was the first game to actually do the cutscenes. FF4 really expanded upon them, but all of the cutscenes in both games ultimately had to do with the existing engine, if you know what I mean. The furthest we'd gotten was watching the Giant of Babel come down, or the mountain range whose name I can't think of opening up so you can get into the underworld, things like that, were as far as the cutscenes had gotten. In FF5, you actually had the ability to use the Mode 7 capacities of the SNES, and rather than just have, a shot of the overworld, uh, we'll do it like this. In FF4, let's say the phone here is the camera. You'd have the overworld, the shot where X-Death is released, and the camera would be here, and maybe it's panning or something like that as X-Death is released. In FF5, because of the new technology, what they did was they could actually have the camera do this and actually move around and pan around the scene, all sorts of things that you just couldn't do previously to that. Similarly, on top of that, the meteors, for example, the meteor coming through and going through the clouds and all that, we look at that now and we just kind of laugh, but that was brand new. They'd never done something like that before. They had to invent a new engine, or rather an addendum to the existing graphics engine, in order to allow them to do that. So, there were a lot of addendums, and they were used properly. This is important. I've said this before, it bears repeating. Whenever you add something like that, a new bit of technology, a new bit of graphics, CGI, or new music tech, or new controller, for example, if you add anything technology-wise to a game, you then have to take that and use it to the benefit of the game, either the gameplay or the narrative. It has to actually work. It has to actually weave itself into making the game a better game rather than just being a gadget or a gizmo. This is what they did with FF5. Every single one of the usages of the new technology, both in the terms of the combat and in the terms of the cutscenes, was used in order to flesh out the game to a significant degree and actually make it flow, make it work, really add to the cinematic, the epic feel of it, and it worked fantastically. And I can't say enough about that. Another excellent example, I'm sorry, just to add one other one really quick here, is the use when they raised the ancient city, where they actually had another rendering of the world map of that area, specifically so that they could do that scene. It's basically another overworld map, but of course they've already perfected that technology by now. But nevertheless, it was something they wanted to do just for that scene to emphasize the impact and the awesomeness of that scene, and it worked great. FF5, uh, while I'm talking about the overworld thing, this is a good segue. FF5 had 3 worlds in it. FF5 was also a gigantic, an enormous game. It really was. And it's hard to properly emphasize this because at first you're really limited. But the progression works really well if you're following what I'm saying here. At first, you basically have you and you're on foot, and that's it, right? You walk around, you reach where you can reach, and you make your way through. It's fairly linear. You get access to the teleporting thing, and then you go and get a boat which can sail without wind because the wind is gone. And I love this because, again, weaves into the narrative. It was a limitation, but rather than just having it be an artificial limitation, which, say, FF3 did, it actually wove it into the narrative such that it made sense that none of the ships were running, that any of the ships you could have gotten and stolen don't work, and so now you have to go and find this steam-powered ship, basically. Actually, magic-powered ship, but they make a steam-powered one after that, and so forth and so on, right? And so then your freedom opens up significantly. And FF5 was not the first game to do this. FF4 was, but FF5 took the idea of the open exploration aspect of the world and expanded on it tenfold. There were so many places you could go to at any point in time, basically once you got the boat on. From that point on, you could go to like 3 or 4 relatively decently sized areas with their own content, with their own lore, with their own backstory, usually with their own bonuses, mini games, class things, the piano, or whatever. Yes, piano. And anybody who's played the game knows what I'm talking about. And actually do something there. And that remains true, when you finally get the airship, the first airship, again, when you get to the second world, again, when you get the dragon, again. You follow what I'm saying here. Each point in time at which you are given a new form of transportation. Actually, the dragon was before the boat. My apologies, but moving on. Each time that happens, the world opens up even more. And so it goes from being linear to being much more open, to being much more open, to being much more open, until it culminates when you have the final airship, which is also a boat, and also a submersible in towards the end of the game, and I thought that was awesome. I thought that was an excellent tool to not only make sure the players are staying on the story and the character, especially early on, but to give the player more choice, more options, more exploration, more free roaming, which is always a good thing if done properly. And on top of that, make it make sense within the narrative, make it make sense within the story perspective, not just randomly hand the player more things and say, here, go, have fun. They made it make sense. That's really my definition of FF5 in a nutshell, to be completely honest with you. FF5 did a lot of new mechanics, new gameplay things, new technology, and every single one of them it wove into the narrative in a beautiful manner. Um, Speaking of which, one of the things they did is, how do I put this? I mentioned back in one of my reviews, I think it was 3, that you need to have a balance between the protagonist and the antagonist, and you need to come up with a way that your protagonist can do anything. Again, rather than doing something completely different, they used the crystals idea, again, the elemental crystals. However, one of the things they also did was they made it make a lot more sense in the story and the lore than it did in FF3, and a lot at the same time both more and less arbitrary. There was no destiny involved, but rather these 4 people were in fact reflections of the 4 elements in their own ways. I'll get into that in a moment. And while they were, how do I put this? the four main characters in FF5 are really unique in, as far as the FF series goes, because all four of them, while connected to the plot in their own separate ways and connected to the overall story, all each of them having some kind of say or role or caring, some investment is the word I want to use within the plot, within the story, within the setting. All four of them were not heroes. They were not warriors of legend. They were not world movers. You know what I'm saying? They were not people who were destined to change the world. They just kind of did because of the way it flowed. FF5 is how I would do a D&D campaign, if that makes any sense. Let me explain a little bit. Rather than say, okay, you're awesome because of blah, what they did was they engineered a situation where it actually made perfect sense in character, in story, for character A and B to interact with each other, and then character C to kind of stumble into it, and then character D to follow suit. And then then it made perfect sense because of the way they interacted, because of the way they met, and because of the way they then pursued their different their different aims, their different ends that they were looking for. It made sense that they would all go in the same direction until they reach the first major plot point when they get to the Wind Crystal, and at that point, it still made sense for them to stick together, and it only continued to make more sense as time went on, as these four became friends, as these four became very close, comrades, as they continued onwards, and I love that. I love the way they used that. But it is important to note that these were four basically nobodies. These were four random people who were relevant, like I said, but had no power, no special abilities, no destined heritage. They were not descendants of the ancients. They were not engineered from birth. They were not trained since they were five in order to be super soldiers. No, no, they were just four people. Four ordinary, for the setting, people who happened to meet each other and then happened to almost literally stumble into the plot. And I actually liked that a lot because it really brought a very everyday man nature to the story. It really brought it down a few levels. So many of the Final Fantasies, both previous and since, have been a lot more up here. The epicness and the heroes and the warriors and the villains and the world saving and all that fun stuff. These were four ordinary Joes down here, along with the rest of us. And these four people nevertheless kept trying and kept striving and accomplished great things. And I thought that was an excellent literary execution, and I thought it was very well done. Now, one of the other things I want to mention as an addendum to this is it was the game was very deliberately paced, which is always an excellent thing when a game is done that. Half-Life is probably my favorite example of a properly paced game, but moving on. Half-Life 1, by the way. But not that I'm saying Half-Life 2 wasn't properly paced, but when I think of perfect pace, I think of Half-Life 1. Moving on. FF5 was extremely well paced, and on top of that, your relative power level goes up over time as you encounter more crystals and as you gain more powers from them. And literally, in a story, in a setting sense, you're gaining the power of these crystals as you go, and in a character sense, you're leveling more because that's how it works, and you're gaining the additional jobs, which are stronger, which let you do more. Blah 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 blah. And so, what we have is a power creep of the characters going up and up and up, and it takes the entire first world for the players to reach a point where they can not actually touch X-Death when he finally gets released. And it takes them through the first world and then the second world and all the things that happen throughout the first two worlds, two-thirds of the game, to be able to stand up and actually fight X-Death. I liked that too because when you have a villain like X-Death, which I will talk about in much greater length towards the end of this review, when you have a villain of that power, of that sheer unmitigated power, you can't just have the protagonist go up and challenge him early on, or not even middle on. You need to have them earn it. You need to have them work up. You need to have them crawl their way to the point where they can actually challenge this guy or girl or whatever, and then actually defeat them. And FF5 did that beautifully. You really do. I'm sorry, my nose really itches today. FF5 really did that beautifully with the power creep and with and having it not only make sense in lore and in character, but in almost a meta sense. You don't fight X-Death until you're ready to because you're not at that part of the game yet. I thought that was extremely well done. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about here really quickly in relation to the down here and the everyday nature of the characters was the fact that humor was used for basically the first time in the Final Fantasy series. FF4, I actually was thinking about this earlier when I was preparing for this review. I don't remember any funny moments in FF4, and I certainly don't in 1, 2, or 3. FF4, I'll use specifically because it's the most fleshed out of the previous ones, was a very serious story. It was a very somber story. There was a lot of death, there was a lot of tragedy, there was a lot of sorrow, and it was beautiful, magnificent, incredible, a work of art. But humor didn't really factor in the equation, and this is probably, I think, tying back to my first point, another one of those reasons why FF5 is a little more maligned of the FFs, because they did have a lot of humor, and a lot of it was the Dragon Quest humor, as I like to call it, or the Earthbound humor. It's not actually hilariously funny. It's hard to explain, actually. It's hard to explain. We're going to stop there. I've heard some people call it Japanese humor because a lot of Japanese console games have had that type of humor, but I don't know if that's a Japanese thing or if it's just the way it's translated over here. I have no idea, to be honest with you. But I liked it. And I do like that type of humor in general, and I did like the fact that the humor was added in FF5. Not only because humor in an FF was not a bad idea, in my opinion, but far more importantly because it did serve, as everything did in FF5, as a narrative tool to get across the point. These are the characters you're dealing with. This is the way these people work and interact with each other. It was used to flesh out characters, not just get a laugh. And like I said, that's FF5 in a nutshell. It wove everything into the story. Everything was to help characterize. Everything was to help flesh everyone out. It was awesome. Let's see here. All right, so I was going to talk about the four heroes next. Like I said, because actually I want to mention one other thing really quick. This was another return to the unrotating thing, which I believe this is basically the last game to do that. I mean, other games have had the one character who never leaves, or characters who don't really leave, but you can rotate in and out. FF5 was the last FF that I'm aware of off the top of my head. I have to think about that a little more. Where you had the four characters, and that was your party from beginning to end. The only exception was the Galuf and Creel thing, which I'll talk about in more detail later. Other than that one exception, it's the party from beginning to end. And there's reasons to do that and there's reasons not to do that. I think they did make a good choice in this matter for such a game that is, again, very down to earth and so incredibly character driven, to the point of exclusion almost character driven. I thought that was a very important point because we see these characters grow and move and mature throughout the course of the game. We learn more about them. We have the game is sufficiently long and in detail that we actually can have callbacks and mentions of previous interactions these characters have had because they've been with each other for so long, for the entire duration of the game, just these four or three really. And I thought that was a good choice in my opinion. I thought that it really helped flesh out the characters. So let's get on to that. Bartz, who has been mistranslated a dozen different ways. Now, Bart's, I admit, I don't actually like that much, to be completely honest with you. Part of that is because I don't like that type of personality in real life. Bart's just kind of goes along with things, but at the same time carries enough of a altruistic streak to him that when it came down to it, it really, you know, perfect example of this is the second scene of the game when he's driving along with Boko and Boko stops and he's like, "What are you doing?" And Boko just looks at him. He's like, "Yeah, I know. You're thinking about the girl and the old man. We should go save them, shouldn't we? Let's go. Let's go help them out." And yes, how do I put this? It's Bart's again was not a overly heroic. He was not Cecil, because Cecil would not have even hesitated. Cecil would have never left their side. Cecil would have gone to help them right off the bat. But that's because he's Cecil. He's the paladin. He's the good guy. Bart's was a person. If you follow what I'm saying here, Bartz was an ordinary guy with ordinary flaws and ordinary motives, but he wasn't a bad guy, and he was nevertheless inclined to do good. He was inclined to help. He just needed a few moments to think about it and maybe a little shove, and he's like, "Okay, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. Let's go help," and does so, and it was a good thing he did for that matter. And that's Bartz in a nutshell. He just kind of goes with things. He doesn't have a lot of uh singular drive in him, save the desire for exploration and freedom, which I suppose makes perfect sense because Bartz is wind. Now, after that we have Lenna, who is very gentle, very altruistic, very feminine, an actual princess, literally gives of herself to the benefit of others. You know, the point where she's walking through poisonous flowers and slowly dying so she can reach the root that will help heal the dragon. And the scene where the dragon refuses to eat because it's afraid of the poisonous plant thing, which makes sense in context. And she decides to eat some of the grass herself to show the dragon that it's okay to eat. It's a rare thing to find someone who is that altruistic. I'm going to stick with that word because I think that suits. It's a rare find to see someone like that. And goodness, I really I really liked the character of Lenna in this, and she is very calm. She is very well, I shouldn't say her calm because she's not actually calm. That's not being truthful. She is very consistent. She is very non-violent is the word I want to use here. While she is not prone to inaction, in fact, she is one of the few characters who is one of the more driving forces, a very active character. She nonetheless behaves as someone who is very consistent in that action, who wants to maintain a steady flow, basically, flow of her actions, flow of her thought processes, which is makes perfect sense since Lenna is water. Then we have Ferris, who is the exact opposite of Lenna. She is brash, she is selfish to a point, of course. She's a tomboy for reasons that are weird and make me wonder. And of course, she's a pirate. You know, and it's worth noting that in this setting, pirates are, of course, romanticized as they always are, but the pirates, nonetheless, were not good people. These were not, oh, ho, yo, ho, ho, and, these were people who stole and people who were perfectly willing to ransom the Princess Lenna in exchange for money because they were pirates, and that's what Ferris was. Nevertheless, Ferris was not a bad person. None of these people were bad people, really. She did actually grow up in essentially the opposite circumstance. While Lenna grew up in a castle, secluded and with only her caretakers and the people are who treat her differently because she's a princess around her. Ferris grew up around the pirates who she had to be as strong as a man, as she put it herself, and she had to I know that's extremely sexist, but whatever. It fit with the setting, and I don't think it's actually sexist because I don't care that she's male or female. She was just, how do I put this? Ferris was trying to be a strong leader, alpha male type. It's only called alpha male because that's what it's called in nature. Can we get off the subject now? Thank you. Throat. Point I'm trying to get across here is that Ferris was growing up in very exceptional circumstances, very trying circumstances. She had to constantly be struggling, fighting, striving, harshening herself. In other words, she was literally forged as you would a sword in the flames, which is appropriate since Ferris was fire. And finally, we have Gallu, who is one of my favorite characters, actually. And he is. Well, let's talk about the amnesia first. Gallu having amnesia, I think, put a lot of players off to that because it felt a little hackneyed. Even then, even then, when the amnesia bit wasn't really something that people did all that often, the fact of the matter is, it felt a little cliche at first. And I'll admit that freely. But the more I think about it, and the more I've replayed FF5, the more it makes sense. Him having amnesia only makes a little bit of sense in character. I'll admit that. It only makes a little bit of sense in story. But what it does is exactly what everything else I've been talking about does. It enhances the narrative. It enhances the story. He has plot-guided, laser point amnesia, and it works exactly how it should, because they needed Galuf there, and he needed to not know everything. And that is a bit of a cop-out, and I admit it, but I forgive it because it doesn't feel particularly stupid, and it does actually enhance the story. At the end of the day, his amnesia does in fact enhance the story. It does actually make things better, and when he finally remembers himself, and this is important, he doesn't act any differently at all. He is still Galuf. He is still noticeably Galuf. And every time his amnesia came up as a plot point, where it was relevant, where it was something he should remember or something he might remember, it was done properly. My favorite example of this was when you're fighting Siren, or rather when you're not fighting Siren, when you're being seduced by Siren, and Galuf is supposedly being brought in, suckered in by the illusion of Creel. And Galuf's response is, I just don't remember who you are. And so this is stupid, so I'm going to break my friends up. Ponk, 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 ponk. And then you actually fight the boss. I thought that was awesome. So that's what I mean. The usage of the amnesia might have been a poor choice, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it was a net positive. Galuf, speaking of which, is a very courageous individual, very determined. He's very indomitable. He has a really bad sense of humor, which I love, to be completely honest with you. He's very punny, and he's extremely rash, but even more so loyal. He's the guy who would, without hesitation, go out of his way and endanger himself in order to save his friends, because by God, he's going to. And all of that makes perfect sense to me. Not only his slight instability, but his extremisms in both directions, because Galuf is Earth. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pause here in the moment of this joviality and mention my favorite scene in FF5, bar none, hands down, and that would be Gallu's death. I really hope that I didn't just spoil that for anybody who was actually going to play the game. Seriously, play the game before you watch my reviews. I mean that sincerely. Um, Gallu's death was in a similar vein to Tella's, but everything that and more. What happened was Galuf was fighting X-Death, and X-Death was using the power of the four crystals to attack him, to use their energy on him, and he just kind of kept coming. And you actually see his HP go to 0, but he doesn't actually fall. He he doesn't die. He doesn't fall over. He doesn't go into unconscious. He just keeps going. He keeps pushing himself. And X-Death starts getting more and more irritated, more and more frustrated, more and more, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What is wrong with you? And then he starts mocking him, thinking he's figured it out. Of course, you're fighting with hatred. That's foolish. Hatred will never defeat me. And Galuf has that wonderful line. This isn't hatred. Wonderful line. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. He has that wonderful line that this isn't anger. This isn't hatred. And X-Death is like, what is it? And he never actually responds. And then Galuf actually defeats him, shatters the crystals to free them, and X-Death has to flee. And then Galuf falls over and dies, and it made perfect sense in so many ways. It was one of the very, very few times when they actually acknowledged game mechanics in a lore perspective and why they didn't work. They tried to cure him. They tried to life him. They tried to use Phoenix Downs on him. I mean this, in the cutscene they actually did so, but it didn't work because he had pushed himself so hard and pushed himself so far beyond death, beyond the point at which he should have fallen and died, that there was nothing left to save. He had expended everything and anything that he had had in order to defeat X-Death, and succeeded. And it's a very powerful scene in my opinion, not just because of the meta example they use, but because of how artistic it was designed. It was moving, it was impacting, and like I said earlier, 4 people from beginning to end, or rather 3 people from beginning to end. You have been with Galu for the entire game. From scene 1, you have been with this gentleman and known him and grown with him and understood him and found out the truth about him and found out his flaws and his hopes and his dreams, and they all just died. And I'm actually messing up just a little bit. It was a wonderful scene. I love that scene. It deserves to be talked about on its own right because, yeah, because it was beautifully done. And no offense to Eris, but Eris's death couldn't even hold a candle to that one, in my opinion. Just my opinion, of course. Now, let's go ahead and get off of that subject. Let's talk about some other things. I've only got a few more bullet points here, which is good, because we're getting on in the time here, aren't we? One of the things FF5 did a lot, I mentioned FF4 started the optionals thing. I wouldn't even necessarily call them mini-games yet, nor would I call the ones in 5 mini-games, or in 6. We didn't actually have mini-games until 7 with the Golden Saucer, and a few other things. But FF5 nevertheless did have optionals. tons of optionals. I was just talking about earlier about the open roaming aspect and the freedom to go to different towns and different places. A lot of those places basically had no purpose except for a couple of optional quests or optional spells or optional items or optional bosses or optional dungeons. Optionals upon optionals. The game was littered with it, and I loved it. I loved the fact that there was so much additional content that, at the very least, helped flesh out the setting, if not the specific story, and in all cases, it gave you more to do. And in a lot of cases, while I'm at it, had more character growth, character development. There were a lot of places. FF5 was also the first game to really do this, where you would go to a place and go to an optional location and either do a dungeon or a boss or even just go into a town, and you would see cutscenes, and that would be your reward. Not an item, not magic, not some new ability, not a progression of the plot, not a new airship or whatever. No, no. What you would get in return for your efforts was story, was cutscene, was background. Lore, actually, is the term I'm looking for here. You would find out more about a character or more about a town or a place or whatever. And I loved that. And the FFs kept doing that for a considerable time after 5. And you also have to consider, because they had the job system in place in FF5, they had that was an excellent tool to allow them to do this. You could have enemies over in Timbuktu over here that gave you certain spells for blue magic. You could have, a summon over here that you could go and fight. I mean, for goodness sakes, Ramu was just roaming in a forest in a certain area on the map, and you could just roam up there and fight him. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Between the summons and the blue magic and the cutscenes and the lore expansion and all the ancient weapons that are mentioned in World 2 and actually opened in World 3, all the ancient spells which you unlock, so many different things you could do that were optional in FF5, and I loved that. But while I'm talking about optional, it is worth noting that Final Fantasy V is the first true super optional. FF3 DS Remake had a super optional. FF4 had several optionals, and the FF4 remakes both had super optionals. But when we're talking timeline-wise, FF5 was the beginning of the super optional. Now, for anybody who's wondering, in case I don't mention, I actually don't recall. A super optional is defined as an optional super boss who is more difficult than the last boss and was made with the explicit intent to challenge the player. More often than not, he doesn't actually give a reward. Sometimes they do. It almost doesn't matter because by the time you can defeat the super optional, you don't need that reward. I'm talking about a material reward. Obviously, every now and again they'd have cutscene or lore rewards. In FF5, you had the Omega weapon. It was actually the beginning of the Omega weapon, which is a trend that would continue until now. Actually, that's a trend that's still going on. But that was the origin of the Omega weapon. Was right there in FF5. He was in the last dungeon and in a room where he was actually a wandering sprite, which you could avoid. But if you walked up and selected him, and it's also worth noting that Omega, the original Omega, back in the original FF5, not the remake, is the second hardest super optional I've personally I've ever fought. The only one who's ever bested him is Sephiroth in Kingdom Hearts, the original Kingdom Hearts. My goodness, Omega was brutal and ridiculous and complicated. It was one of the first one of the first optional bosses that had a real trick to him. Yes, I know Go-Go was also in FF5, but you get the point. And you had to really think about how you were going to fight him, and you really had to have a very concrete strategy walking in, and you had to know exactly what you're going to do, exactly how you're going to do it, and you had to execute it perfectly. And this is where that ATB thing comes in as well. And I thought it was awesome. I loved it. I loved the Omega fight, and I loved the fact that it was there. I loved the fact that the very first time I saw him, I was like, "What was that?" And he demolished the floor with me. Awesomeness, awesomeness incarnate. Um, Now let's talk about a couple other things here really quick. I didn't mention Creel earlier. That's because I'm an idiot and wanted to mention it earlier, but I forgot to. Creel was obviously a replacement for Gallu. Totally different personality type. Honestly, didn't have nearly as much of an impact on the story as Gallu, and that actually has to do with limitations of budget and time. They just didn't have too much to do with her. However, it is worth noting that Creel was used very effectively before she joined the party, ironically. And in several instances, she was. I'm just going to say this outright. Creel was the prototype Eros, and I use Eros specifically because most people identify with Eros. But that personality type, that archetype, has been a truth in FFs in general since FF5, actually since FF4 to be honest with you. But Creel was the actual prototype for where that would go. This was where the actual foundation was laid. Creel was the mystical type character. You know, she had wisdom beyond her years. She was definitely more intelligent than other people. Certainly, people who were older than her. She was female. I hate to mention that. I don't mean not trying to sound like her being female matters per se, but the vast majority of the characters of this type in the Final Fantasy series were also female. Eris, of course, comes immediately to mind. She had a very strong personality. She was very forceful in that personality. She had no hesitation about speaking her mind or doing what was necessary. She was active to the point of rash, but not actually being rash. She was actually the voice of reason between her and Galu, ironically enough. That all those little personality traits that define that kind of person, like Eris, were present in Creel, and she had the unique abilities thing too going for her. She could talk to animals, for example, and she could sense when someone was trying to contact her, and she knew when someone was in trouble. It was that vague. In Star Trek terms, you would call her the Counselor Troy because she well, that's being a bit cheap, and I apologize. I don't mean that as an insult. But most people, when they use the term the Counselor Troy ability, use it as a derogatory because they mean that she can do whatever the plot requires. That's not what I mean. I mean, whenever there was something of a vague nature, something that was vaguely mystical or spiritual or magical that wasn't concrete, she would be the one to pick it up. Now, I think that was a good thing. I actually like Creel, like I said, especially before she joins the party, ironically. And I thought that was an interesting character type to bring into the series. Not my favorite character, of course. That would be Gallu. But nevertheless, a very interesting concept to move with. I like that. Now, what's our next point here? Ah, yes. Chocobos were not unique to FF5, and neither were Moogles, but I'm going to mention both of them here rather than back in the respective games where they were introduced. The reason why is because in the previous games, Moogles and Chocobos were just kind of there and had no real relevance. In FF5, for the first time, Chocobos and Moogles, both, were actually woven into the narrative, just like everything else was. They were actually plot relevant. And the the Moogles, for example, well, I'm not going to go into details, but both the Moogles and the Chocobos, especially Boko and his wife, and their adventures together, were incredibly relevant, incredibly important to the story. The story wouldn't have happened if not for both, and it also reflected very well in the characters. Both species cannot talk, obviously, or rather they can talk to Creel, but you get the point. They cannot vocalize to us, the players. And so rather than use that as a crutch, what they did was they used that as a tool, the outline tool, which I've mentioned many times. It's one of my favorite literary effects. You have this outline of a character back here, a character type, the Moogles or the Chocobo in this case, and they can't talk, they can't communicate. All they can do is give basic direction. Therefore, you can use this outline to better emphasize the character in front of it. Bart's, for example, in the case of the Chocobo, or Creel or Lenna in the case of the Moogles. You can actually emphasize more about the character, learn more about that character through action, showing us more what that character is like, rather than just saying they are into this. You can actually show it through action and really get the point across. I've always felt in any form of medium or work that showing someone's personality is much more effective than simply saying they are a blah person, actually saying it flat out. And FF5 did that in spades, and so that's one of the reasons, that is the reason why I'm mentioning those two here. And of course, FF5, they were also wildly popular, and so FF5 is what gave the Moogles and the Koopos, wow, the Moogles and the Chocobos their staying power. Obviously, they'd existed before, and they'd been used again before. Chocobos have been in the games twice so far. But FF5, they were actually popular to the point of actually being, how do I put this, seen as symbols of the game, and that just only became more true as time went on, and so they were there to stay basically, and we have FF5 to thank for that, for good and for bad. Um, if my throat didn't hurt so much, I would go ahead and say this. My friend Pax was telling me how I need to talk about Gilgamesh. Oh, I can't do it. I can't get loud enough. I'm sorry. Gilgamesh is awesome. Let's just put it out there. Gilgamesh is the source of so much of the awesome comedy in this game. Not even the bad comedy I was talking about earlier, the comedy that, only certain people find amusing. No, no. Gilgamesh was hilarious and awesome. He was the strangest combination of incredibly competent and at the same time dangerously stupid and really hilarious while at the same time being deadly serious. It's really hard to describe that type of character. I'm sure there's a character type and term for what that character personality type is, but my goodness, it was actually awesome. It was an awesome combination. And Gilgamesh and his super mighty morphin time um, were absolutely fantastic. And on top of that, one of the things I liked best about Gilgamesh is he just kind of was going along with things. You don't actually know why. I assume, based on the information that Death was threatening him, or bribing him, or both. But it is completely unsurprising that Gilgamesh eventually turns on your enemies and ends up helping the party because it's Gilgamesh, and that's what he would do. And it's and that his whole death scene, which wasn't actually a death scene, where he helps you to defeat the one villain whose name I actually can't think of right now, in the new, in the Void, depending on which version you're playing, was awesome, was perfect. I loved it. It is also worth noting that Gilgamesh, and I'm going to mention this here, is a strange oddity in the Final Fantasy series. They didn't start doing this immediately, but Gilgamesh was the beginning of continuity of the Final Fantasy series. It didn't actually come up until much later, until all the way over in FF8, I believe, actually. But this was the first time they laid the seeds, and they did this on purpose, consequently, to actually have the possibility for continuity in the future. And Gilgamesh is one of the connecting points of several of the Final Fantasy games, not the least of which includes the final proof that we have, and we've been wondering this for some time, or we, total geeks such as I, had been wondering for some time whether or not Dissidia was actually canon. And the strongest evidence we have that it is because Gilgamesh was in it, and not just in it, like, because I mean, obviously everyone else was in it, but Gilgamesh was in it with his full memories. And Gilgamesh was fully aware of everything that was happening. And this was a Gilgamesh post FF5, which makes actually a lot of sense if you really look into it and really think about it. So, yeah. Um, and of course, Gilgamesh was in FF8 and FF9, and moving on. Point being, I thought that that introduction was awesome, and like I said, it was the first time they had really said, okay, we need to reevaluate. Do we really want these to be different settings? Do we really want them to be completely unconnected? Obviously, they didn't really do anything that with like anything with that for many, many years. In fact, the next truly strong connection point for for continuity between the FFs wouldn't actually come until Final Fantasy X-2, and then the remakes, which would go back and start adding continuity, continuity into the games as they go. But I thought it was worth mentioning that the seed for that was planted all the way back in FF5, way back in the SNES. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about before I get to my little checklist per FF is there were a lot of characters in FF5, and I know I've said this 3 times so far, counting this time. But I really mean it. FF5 went above and beyond. There were characters everywhere, NPCs, named NPCs. FF5 had an astonishing number of named NPCs. FF4 had a lot of NPCs, lots of whom had their own character or personality, even if they only had a few lines to them. But FF5 had tons of characters with names who had multiple lines each, and in many cases had actual stories to themselves. You would find FF5 was the first time you would talk to an NPC and they would talk about something that wasn't related to the plot. It wasn't related to the story. It was related to them and their little world. That was the first time they started doing that fleshing out of the setting. And it would continue. This is another trend that FF5 started. It would continue for many games past that in the FF series. They really wanted to give you that feeling that you're in a world. Didn't quite accomplish it, but they got dang close in my opinion. And the fact that they had to do that for so many NPCs and so many different towns and so many different areas in 3 worlds, well, technically 2, was amazing, and I really just have to, my goodness. Now, let's go ahead and hit the bullet point here. Music. Music, music, music. FF5 has amazing music. It's not as amazing as the other 2 of the SNES era. In fact, I don't believe any 5 songs are on my Zero playlist, to use that as a basis, a meter. However, FF5 had very experimental music. This is the FF3 aspect again. Nobuo Uematsu was trying out different things again and really expanding his horizons. And one of the funny things for a game that is generally considered relatively lighthearted is FF5 had very somber music. One of the reasons for that is because FF5, when you really sit down and think about it, is actually a very somber game. Ignoring the fact that there's a death of a player character in the game, which is a first, not counting Tella. Um, they really there was a lot of tragedy, there was a lot of death, there was a lot of failure throughout FF5, and throughout it, you're just trying to keep going, and then you fail. I know this happens in a lot of FFs and a lot of RPGs in general, but you do fail at the wind crystal, and then you fail at the water crystal, I believe was next. Whatever, and then you fail at the fire crystal, and you fail at the earth crystal, then you fail to stop X Death, then you get dragged over to the other world, then you fail at X Death's castle, then you fail. You literally do nothing but fail and try to keep going and get stronger as you go until you get to the third world when you finally start accomplishing things. And, because you failed to stop X Death from remerging the worlds and unleashing the void, or the Moo. Or is it new? I actually don't remember. I think it's new. Anyways, so, it was a very somber tone, but it was very, this is going to sound very strange, but the music was very down to earth. The music very much met the theme. Yes, it was very somber, so it was very tragic. It did have the occasional lighthearted whoa pieces, like Boko de Chocobo comes to mind immediately. But on top of that, you also had music that was not epic. As strange as that sounds, it was not epic. It was not amazing. It was not Lord of the Rings, oh, or like FF4 itself did. It was very down to earth. It was very almost plain. And I have to imagine that was done by design because of the theme of the game as a whole, which, if I haven't gotten this point across yet, was the perseverance of normalcy in this case. Or if you prefer, again, because complicated theme and you can't really say it in a single sentence, but everything I've said so far, the common man and the ideals and everyone working together and all that fun stuff, the everyday people kind of a thing, which was one of the strongest themes of FF5. The whole, excuse me, the whole that whole theme just comes out in the music, and only three or so songs actually go above that, and all of them have to do with X Death, actually, which makes perfect sense when you think about it. But now, the last dungeon, within the void itself, I thought was absolutely amazing. It was the first time they did the trippy dungeon thing, and anybody who's played more recent Final Fantasies knows exactly what I'm talking about. FF9 was a particularly bad offender on that one. FF10 was probably the worst offender on that one. Because at least FF9 was explained. FF10 was just weird, and then here's weird, and then here's some more weird for no reason. Yes, I know it was inside Sin. Yes, I know memories, blah, blah, blah. It still was never actually given concretion, unlike at least FF9 and far more strongly FF5. But my point is, that whole last dungeon was awesome. The last dungeon's music was good. It was nowhere near as good as many of the other ones I would mention, so I'll be honest, it wasn't that great. It was certainly good, though. But the whole trek through there was amazing and incredibly cool looking. As usual, brand new graphics, brand new tile set. You would actually warp between floating islands in the abyss, which, because that's where you are, the abyss, literally, and interact with all the different towns, all the different places that have been trapped in. And one of my favorite sections by far was the sequence where you actually you encounter a town that you've already encountered before back in the real world, and that town was just frozen in place, and so you looked through and there was a bunch of people who wouldn't interact with you, so okay, whatever, you get the loot and leave. And it was this wonderful mystery that was just left hanging there, because when you finally encounter it again in the new, they're all moving again, and you find out that this is a town that was frozen in time as a result of the everything that went down with the splitting of the world and the defeat against. Oh my goodness, I suddenly can't think of his name. I'm sorry, give me just a moment. I'm sorry, this is gonna bother me if I don't think of it. Uh, and with the defeat of the guy whose name I'm going to give you in a minute, and so I thought that was really cool that they actually laid the seed for that little bit of reveal way, way, way back before, and you can actually go somewhere with it when you're in the last dungeon. That's when the payoff is, and there wasn't even necessarily a huge amount of Inuo. That was his name, Inuo. Sorry, there wasn't even a large amount of like particular story or lore relevance. It was just, well, actually, it was lore. It wasn't story relevance. It was just lore relevance. It was just fleshing out of the setting, and I loved that. Nobody there even knew what the heck was going on, but you could tell based on what you, the player, knew what was going on. Awesomeness. I actually love it. Now, to continue, I'm sorry. There we go. So the last dungeon was awesome. Now, FF5 did something a little bit strange. As I mentioned back in FF4, they started the trend of the front man, Golbez in this case, who wasn't actually the villain, who was actually just a front for Zemus, who was the real villain. And FF6 did that with Geshtal. FF7 did that with Shinra, Shinra the president, and then Shinra the company. FF8 did that with Adia. FF9 did that with Kuja or Garland, depending on how you define that, or Queen Braun, more definitively. Blah 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 blah. FF5 had no frontman. FF5 had X-Death. You find out about X-Death very early on in the game. You don't actually meet him until the end of the first world, but you do hear about him. You know what's going on, and you know why things are going on the way they are pretty early on. I don't think you actually hear his name early on, so I apologize. But you know that there's this evil entity and is trying to escape, right? And then you hear more about him, and then you hear more about him, and you find out more about him, and then you actually meet him, and then you basically interact with him constantly until the end of the game. He is very much a... I personally kind of think of X-Death as a prototype for Kefka, because the two of them are very similar from a literary perspective. They're both hideously evil, and yet they're both very entertaining. And it's very hard to explain that quality, because, yeah. But X-Death was very much, how do I put this? He wasn't crazy, he wasn't a showstopper, but he had a strange sense of humor, a morbid sense of humor, one might say. He was also an interesting example of a villain. I'll get into that more in a moment. But he was very present, if you know what I mean. You constantly were encountering him. You were constantly interacting with him, more so than you were with Golbez back and forth, for example. More so than most of these examples I just listed. You were interacting with X-Death like every few hours at the minimum, usually more often than that, and that's including time spent leveling in the overworld or dungeons or whatnot. X-Death was all over the place, and it was awesome. And he also had a freaking cool theme while I'm at it. Loved the X-Death theme song. The Dark Lord X-Death. Or is it the Evil Lord X-Death? I can't remember. But X-Death was a very interesting type of villain. It's something they've never done before or since, to my knowledge. You see, of the various FF villains, I have thought about them at length because I'm a geek, and where they would rank in relation to each other in terms of power, in terms of personality, in terms of evil, fun stuff like that, right? It is in my opinion that X-Death is, without question, the most evil villain in the Final Fantasy series. X-Death is the amalgamation, the combination, the forced compression of Lord knows how many evil entities and spirits and everything that were shoved into a single tree which was used as a prison until there was so much concentrated evil in that tree that the tree came to life and started walking around and calling itself X-Death. And that's his origin story. And he also had all of the power of all those people, which brings me to my second point. X-Death was so powerful that to some degree he frightened himself. This is mentioned in several things, both in the game and some of the extracurricular items. X-Death actually was afraid of his own power because he was that strong. The only other individuals who would really come to this level would be Kuja, post-trance, and Mateus, Emperor Mateus. X-Death was just raw, crazy, evil power. There was no gray here whatsoever. We were going back to the absolute black thing. X-Death was not gray in any way, shape, or form. There was nothing sympathetic. There was nothing redeemable. He was pure black evil. And now the trick here is that while Mateus and Garland both had, or Chaos, both had that to some degree, X-Death had that and they explained it. The other two had it by virtue of lack of evidence to the contrary, basically. X-Death, they bothered going into detail about just how evil he was, and just how screwed up he was, not just in his backstory, but in his actions throughout the game. X-Death was a very interesting type of villain, and I think it was a good move for a game like this. When you have people who are so down to earth, and so earnest and honest, and well, I shouldn't say honest, they're just earnest, they're true to themselves. They're just people. They're just ordinary folk, common folk, and you have them pitted against what is literally the concentration of all evil in a single sentient form, which is trying to unleash a power that even he is terrified of in order to reduce everything into the nothingness. Yeah, I think that works really well. I think that's an excellent contrast, and one of the reasons why they had to ramp the heroes up across two worlds in order to be able to fight him in his non-powered up form, and then a third world in order to fight him for the last time. And it's worth noting that you actually don't defeat X-Death. I think this is actually awesome. Or I shouldn't say you don't defeat him. You don't destroy him. You don't finish him. You do defeat him, three times actually total, but I'm talking about the last fights. You do defeat him, but ultimately what really happens is he is then consumed by his own power. He is consumed by his power and by the void, and he is absorbed back into it and reduced to the nothingness that he was wanting. That's what defeats X-Death himself, basically, and that's exactly how it should be with a villain like that. I thought that was awesome. I thought that was excellently done, and a perfect ending, a perfect send off to him. Now, I mentioned the last boss thing. I want to talk about the last boss next because that's the next thing here. Um, X Death was also the first example of the multi-phase last boss thing, which had become a steady current for I think every Final Fantasy since then. Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that. The multi-final boss things, which in some cases has grown to obscene levels, but three last bosses after this point was generally the norm. But in FF5, you had two. Phase 1 and Phase 2, basically. You had X Death, who had unleashed his tree form. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. His true form. His true form. And as a tree, and had revealed himself, and you fight him, and you defeat him, blah, 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 blah. And then he comes back as all of the evil spirits just kind of mashed together, fighting you. And then he gets shoved back into the void and disintegrated or moved, erased. And I actually think that was a good move. I personally think 3 is the limit on how high you should go. I have seen a couple games, I've seen a game at the very least go to 4, which still worked. But 2 was a good number, in my opinion. You have the fight, and then the villain. The reason the one-winged angel form has always made a degree of sense to me is because the reason the one-winged angel form works is because they've always had that level of power. They've always had the ability to push themselves just that far and become just that powerful. But it costs them. It costs them sanity. It costs them their existence. In some manner, it defeats them. So the logic is there that if they defeat you, they aren't going to be accomplishing much after that because they've already lost so much of themselves. So the one-winged angel thing has always been a last-ditch effort type of concept that makes sense to me. And so having a phase 1 where you're fighting the villain and then phase 2 where you're fighting the one-winged angel form makes perfect sense to me. And it certainly made perfect sense in the case of X-Death. And again, it was used to flow into the narrative, to get across the point, to finally show you what X-Death really was, underneath the armor, underneath the bark for that matter, all the evil things that had been sitting in its existence for however long. So, very excellently done. The last boss songs were incredible. I shouldn't say incredible, they were very good. One more step down. They really emphasized the theme and the tone, and the ending of FF5 was very good, very long actually, but I would probably rate it as, say, my third favorite of the FF endings. Very good ending. Very, very roundabout circle. It really showed, okay, here's everything that's going on, and here's the lives of all the people, and here's all the people who have fallen, and, perfect blend of sadness and joy and over rejoicing and all that fun stuff. It was an excellent ending. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about, which usually should be the last thing, I keep messing this up, is the remake. There has been a proper remake to FF5 on the GBA. In fact, it has been the only proper release of FF5 outside of Japan. Sorry, I'm still a little annoyed at that fact. So, if you're going to pick up a copy of FF5, I recommend the Game Boy Advance version, because there's not a lot of other options. Yeah, there's the PlayStation 1. Don't pick that one up. Just don't. Do yourself a favor. But in all seriousness, the proper remake was really well done. It did refine the combat system a bit and added some of the modern conveniences, just like they did with FF4. There are still a few issues. There was actually a bug in the ATB system itself, which is hard to explain, and I'm not going to bother boring you with it. But long story short, that you can exploit it, and it kind of makes some of the battles a little weird. Um, but they did add additional content. They did add additional lore-relevant content. They did add additional super weapons. I'm sorry, super optionals. Three of them actually. Omega again, Shinryu, and of course my personal favorite, Enuo. Yes, the actual guy they've mentioned several times in FF5 and the original FF5 as well, not just the remake. The guy who actually was the original source of the void and or the new, and you actually fight him, and he's an interesting fight. He's pretty brutal. And they added a few additional classes, which I thought was absolutely awesome. They actually added classes to the job system. My God, yes. And they're all awesome in their own way, and the last one you get is suitably overpowered, which you get from beating Enuo. All of it was awesome. The optional dungeon, the additional lore, the touching up of the dialogue is the first release I've seen them do where the dialogue was actually appropriate and proper. And I highly recommend it. Not, unfortunately, I don't have much else to add about it, but it was a proper remake. It was well done, and they didn't change too much. All they did was add and improve, which is what a proper remake really should be, shouldn't it? So, my throat really hurts now, so hopefully it'll be rested enough by tomorrow, because tomorrow I've got a really good game to talk about. The best game ever made. So I will see you guys tomorrow.